Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to the first meeting of the Junior Faculty Forum in 2021. And before we start the meeting, I want to welcome Dr. Dinesh Samararatne, who is going to chair today's meeting uh, as one of two new advisors for the Junior Faculty Forum, apart from Dinesh, the other person who will be advising us is Ms. Swati Javeri. So we are extremely grateful to both Dinesh and Swati to join the effort and to help us in running the JFF. So thank you very much. And other than that, yeah, I will just turn my video off and participate in this discussion. So over to you, Dinesh.
Thank you, Tarun. Let me add my welcome to that of Tarun as we kick off the first workshop of the Junior Faculty Forum for Indian Law Teachers for the year 2021. The Junior Faculty Forum, as it has been advertised, is a gathering of law academics with an interest in South Asia and is devoted to supporting research by early career academics. It aims to engage with works in progress with a view to offering robust and constructive feedback to the author. To paraphrase Tarun, if you're asking a question or making a comment to help the author, you're most welcome to engage in this forum. But if you're intervening to sound clever, perhaps you shouldn't. So the JFF is the brainchild of Tarunabh Khaitan, who is the Professor of Public Law at the Faculty of Law at Oxford University. And the forum is convened by Dr. Animesh Dias of Xavier Law School, Kolkata, Mr. Prakash Meena of the University of Delhi, and Ms. Swati Singh Parmar of Dharmashastra National Law University. I would like to thank Animesh, Prakash, and Swati for their wonderful work that makes this forum possible every month. Now today, we will be discussing a paper by Ms. Anushka Medawatte. Anushka is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law at the University of Colombo and a dear colleague. Anushka's research interest lies in constitutional law and international humanitarian law. And today we will be discussing her paper titled Single Stories, Selective Amnesia, and the Stillbirth of Constitutional Reforms, A Story of Sri Lanka. And in this paper, Anushka considers the problem of competing accounts of Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict and the impact of these quoting her single stories on Sri Lanka's project of constitutional reform. I've had the benefit of reading this paper at its early stages and look forward to engaging with her on this today. As indicated in the announcement of this workshop, we will proceed on the basis that all participants have pre-read the paper. Now to discuss Anushka's paper, we have two excellent scholars with us today, Dr. Adeel Hussain and Dr. Asanga Welikala. I'll introduce them briefly before we invite our discussants to share their responses to the paper. Sorry. Dr. Adeel Hussain is an assistant professor of legal and political theory at the Institute of Political Science at Leiden University of the Netherlands. He's also senior research affiliate at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. His research work is in the areas of legal and political theory, comparative public law, and the history of international law. Adeel, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are delighted to have you as a discussant today. Our second discussant is Dr. Asanga Welikala, lecturer in public law and acting director of the Edinburgh Centre for Constitutional Law. Asanga's research work is in the area of plurinational constitutionalism and secession, comparative federalism and devolution, constitutional transitions and incrementalism, among other things. Asanga is one of our leading experts on all matters constitutional in Sri Lanka, and we are delighted, Asanga, that you've accepted our invitation. So today's workshop will proceed as follows. Adeel will offer his responses to Anushka's paper for about 10 to 15 minutes, and Asanga will follow thereafter. I will then invite Anushka to respond if she would like to, And thereafter we will open the floor for Q&A, and we have in total 1.5 hours. So now I would like to invite Adeel to present his responses. Over to you, Adeel.
Thank you so much, Dinesh, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Danushka, for sharing this very, very exciting paper. I learned a lot from reading it, and what I'm going to offer here is a brief response to 3 positions that you take in this paper, and they're meant to strengthen the argument that is already there. So in that sense, you may be able to boost the conceptual strength of the article. You do give a nod to a review already in the paper, so I'm not really sure at what stage the paper is at, but I hope that you still can make changes, and if not, then I think it's just generally good to have somebody respond to your paper. So I'm going to raise 3 points, each are about 2 or 3 minutes, and hopefully I'll be able to wrap up in 10 minutes or so. The first point that I wanted to raise has to do with the history of grievance that can be spun by groups, and the consequence that you draw from it, which is to discard history altogether. And it's essentially one of the big conceptual moves that you make in the paper, where you're saying that, you know, we have these 2 rivaling groups in Sri Lanka who are sort of participating in the constitutional process, and they both see history differently. So they have their own narratives, what you call single stories. And because they have their single stories, they enter into this tunnel vision and are not able to engage with the other side, which leads to the constitution being stillborn. So you move away from that, and you reject that way of looking back into the past. And you say that there's also no benefit of looking into the past, because both groups have different moments that they can hang on to. And because they have different moments that they can hang on to, they, of course, come to different results in the present. So when you move away from, you know, looking into the past in order to find out what really happens, the sort of police constable way of looking into the past, you know, how did it really happen? Who's guilty? Like, who's more guilty? And you reject that entirely. You enter a new terrain that we may call the terrain of the speculative philosopher, who sort of looks at the mental preconditions that people need to have in order to walk together forward into a sort of more rosy constitutional democracy together. And the first thing that I want to flag here, of course, I'm being trained as a historian, you know, I feel like the urge of defending the discipline. So maybe thinking about what the benefits are of actually looking in the past and why you reject everything outright. So why not say that, you know, there is a way of writing history where one takes documents and manuscripts seriously and follows and tries to map the history of the conflict, and let's say not from the time of Ram when he tries to free Sita from the island of Lanka, but at least from, say, the 16th, 17th, or 18th century, where we take like a point and then, you know, try to figure out how it really happened. And these are also the battlegrounds of historians, I would assume. I don't know the historiography of Sri Lanka too much, but I would assume that a lot of historians have staked their positions, and there's a lot of active discussion happening on what happened when and how. And when you say that the problem of the constitutional stillbirth is in a way the meta history or the meta narrative that the Sinhalese and the Tamilians sort of adopt, you go to sort of 3 ways in which they're trying to negotiate that. I mean, one, that they use history in order to inflict violence upon the other group, to deny hurt that is caused by the other group, or to deny some of the hurt that has been caused to the other group, and then partially acknowledge or downplay what has happened in the past. Like you say, these are the 3 ways in which they engage with history. Therefore, they lead into this very specific conundrum. So if we reject that, or if we throw that all out of the window and then just sort of focus to the future, what is it that we are losing here? And somebody like the legal theorist Carl Schmitt would look at it and he would say that, well, that they're using narratives in order to produce political legitimacy allows them to point towards a political enemy. It allows them to be political. So once we discard that history of grievance, what we have is apolitical interest groups as opposed to political agents. So I would um, so I would like for you to sort of maybe think about that a little more. So what are the benefits of actually having a history of grievance and having a tunnel vision? Um, and even though you don't need to, of course, follow Schmidt in that sense of saying that, it allows you to point towards the enemy, and therefore, we have this sort of Hobbesian way of society. Um, the next point that I want to raise is that if we reconstruct history through, say, rationality, so we follow Leopold von Ranke now, the father of the historical method. So we follow him now and we say, okay, we take it seriously and we use rationality in order to arrive at a narrative that may be more hospitable or conducive for a better constitutional exchange between these two groups. So if we discard that, the other way could look something like a Gandhian view that emphasizes compassion, that says that, okay, let's not use rationality in order to figure out who hurt whom, when, and how strongly, but let's just say that we have compassion for your hurt. Now, the difficulty with these now, the difficulty with that position that Gandhi also faced in a big way in the mid 20th century in India is that usually trust is broken between two groups after a war. So trust was broken between Hindus and Muslims in the mid 20th century, of course, when Muslims no longer felt that they could rely or trust Hindus as a majority in a democratic system. So if that trust is broken, how do we really find a space for compassion that the other group can trust? And usually it's the minority group. And I know that you sort of don't want to use these tropes of majority and minority, but if we were to sort of adopt that position, don't we come into the same conundrum that Gandhi thrust the Indian political into when he just said that, well, what needs to happen is not a constitution, but the Muslims just need to trust that the Hindu majority will treat their rights or protect their rights in a good way, and there's no need for safeguards. There's no need, in fact, for any written constitution. So it moves away from a sort of contractual understanding of how communities sort of relate to each other to a sacrificial understanding of how groups relate to each other. And I wonder if we would move from history, understood here as a narrative for political legitimacy, these two groups who say like, oh, you've grieved me, oh, you've done this to my group, and now I'm going to react in this and that way. So if we move away from that, say we would discard it, that doesn't mean that we have to throw out history altogether, but we could still rely as lawyers, constitutional lawyers at that, on the history of jurisprudence, which in Sri Lanka has a history that at least begins from the colonial period. And if we take that history seriously, that history of jurisprudence as a foundational stone on which to build a constitution, then we would probably have to engage with the sort of key conceptual tropes that were sort of developed in the long 19th century. And what we have here is two people in particular that we could see as the sort of as the bookends of that view. And the first one would be Carl Friedrich von Savigny, mid-19th century German thinker, who was very much into history. He founded the historical school of jurisprudence. And what he said, and it's very similar to what you are saying, is that he denied his age the ability for legislation. So he said because the people around him, particularly those in political power, have such a wrong view of events and such a wrong view of how they got to the position in which they're in, we should not allow them to dabble into jurisprudence, to dabble into legislation. And what he did instead was to prop up lawyers in order to fill that void. So he says that that political void that has been opened by the inability of his age to produce laws needs to be filled by lawyers. And of course, he comes from a very different position. It's Germany. It's the mid-19th century, and revolutions are happening. It's 1848. He looks around him and he says, like, whoever should govern, it shouldn't be these guys around me. So it should be these liberal revolutionaries, because they are not able to do it. And what he levels against that instead is the study of Roman sources and archives. And he says that if we have a sense of Roman law that only jurists can understand, then we will be able to structure and govern a specific state in a better way than if we leave that to the whims of the current age. And the other person that forms the end node is, of course, Jeremy Bentham, who says the opposite. Who says, like, we don't need to look back, we need to look forward. Like, we have philosophy. Philosophy is amazing. Let's do legal positivism all the way. So between these two positions, you would have to find a way, I would say, to sort of situate your argument. And your argument seems to follow Savigny, but still discard history, which is very interesting. So it mixes up like these two, sort of very separate positions in an interesting way. But I feel that something could come out of a productive engagement with that. And I mean, the big article that has been written on this is, I think it was in the early 2000s by Duncan Kennedy, who's looked at classical legal thought. So he calls the Savignian position classical legal thought. And this is also the time when Savigny is being translated and used by colonial administrators in order to give rights to cultural groups, religious groups, to Muslims, to Hindus. That's why the British are able to draw that distinction between private and public law and allow religious groups to structure their own private law, but still keep public law separate from it. So I would be interested to see how that history leads to the stillbirth of the Sri Lankan constitution. And the last point that I want to raise just very briefly is the underlying assumption of the paper is that constitutions are ways of reconciling two groups with very different political agendas. So that is taken as the premise, and then the failure is sort of being pointed out as stemming from the wrong views that these people have. And also, therefore, the metaphor works that you're using, the metaphor of the stillbirth, because the constitution is like a baby that the parents are, for some reason, unable to bring to see the light of day. And I'm wondering here if that is really an apt description of the constitutional process. So can we really say that constitutions are like babies in that sense, that if you're not able to produce a good liberal constitution, something is wrong with your people? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Like, if people don't come to the conclusion that a liberal constitution is workable, wouldn't that be a very legitimate position of taking a different political form? So why is it that liberal constitutionalism has to be seen as the one way to reconcile it all? Why couldn't we say that, well, there is just a different political culture that, perhaps leads to a different outcome, and maybe to a different political form that doesn't require a written constitution in that sense? So the blame of a failed constitution doesn't necessarily lie upon the people who are not able to implement it, but it could also be that that method of bringing people together may be fraught. And with that, I would just like to end my comments and just say that I've very much enjoyed the paper, and it really enriched my own understanding. I know very little about Sri Lankan history, and this really helped me a great deal. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Adeel. Just want to react to one of the points that you made towards the end, Adeel, about the idea of stillbirth. I think, Anushka, you discussed this before when I looked at your early draft of this paper. I was wondering about the use of the idea of stillbirth for very different reasons. But it ties up with something that you touched on, Adeel, this question of blame. So speaking as a woman, I wonder whether this idea of stillbirth can carry other implications for your readers in terms of what you're trying to do with the metaphor, and whether it will reinforce certain problematic assumptions which we don't actually associate ourselves with. But I mean, I have to agree with Adeel. I recognize the impulse behind the paper, and I appreciate it, especially as someone who's grown up having access to the Sinhala community and the Tamil community, and understanding that, or living with the fact that they have these two different worldviews about the same incident, almost. I just want to push back a little bit, Danushka, before I give the floor to Asanga, about your tone and style in the paper, which again I have raised with you before. I, among a few others, are very keen to try to make academic work as accessible as possible. Also mindful of the fact that we are in a region where English is our second language. So that's another point that I just want to flag at this point, and of course we can discuss this later. Asanga, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dinesha. Let me also begin by thanking you and Tarun particularly, but also JFF for this is a hugely needed initiative for South Asian scholars to get together and discuss matters. South Asia is a region that has always had common challenges and of course common conditions, histories, cultures, and it was quite remarkable that we really never had a forum to get together, and in that sense, many congratulations for this and the other exciting work with the Indian Law Review that you are all doing. I am at one remove very much a huge supporter of all that work and happy to always help. Thank you to Danushka, of course, for all the work that has gone on. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I'm not quite sure what Dinesh was going on about in terms of style and content. I think it was a really very well-written paper, very engaging, and I think insofar as you put across what you want to say, it's done very very clearly, and I have no the nitpicking that I'm just about to embark on is not about the fact that you're not making yourself clear. It's about other things, and please do understand that any criticism is offered in the most constructive spirit possible. You are engaging with a question of major relevance, if not the fundamental constitutional challenge or problem that bedevils any discussion of Sri Lankan constitutional law. And of course, it's also of great interest to comparative constitutional law. How to navigate these kinds of fundamental constitutional disagreements, which lead to then has sort of all sorts of knock-on effects on constitutional performance and democratization and all of that kind of. So it's very relevant, and I do hope that the paper is published. So what I'm just about to say is about how I think, from the perspective of a comparative and Sri Lankan constitutional lawyer, how you might want to think about further revisions in order to make the argument stronger and more punchier, and then do a little bit more work with some of the things that you are doing already, but to ensure that you really clench the status of the paper as an original contribution, or at least a substantial contribution to our understanding of these problems. And before I begin, may I just also associate myself with Adeel's comments. I found myself agreeing very much with lots of what he said, but also because my kind of methodological preferences as a constitutional lawyer is, unlike yours, Danushka, quite historicist. I like going back to history a lot. And I think that it's one of the places where some of the battles, and yours is a striking position on that. It's not as if you're not taking a position on that, but let me try and raise some questions that arise for somebody like me who's reading your argument. So just a few very brief comments to begin with. I thought, as I mentioned already, I thought it was clearly written and engaging and thoughtful and skeptical, and you're not scared to be critical where you felt you needed to be critical. I found the critique of Neil particularly interesting. Not sure I agreed with you, but nonetheless, I felt that you made the point well and you supported it, right? And in that sense, it's an interesting paper to read. And also in terms of a comment on style, part of the why the writing is a little engaging is you do sprinkle all sorts of references to non-academic works and authors who have inspired you, such as, for example, Michelle Obama's book, and then you make a reference to how you responded to a particular point that you make. But that also illustrates a certain problem. You use the metaphor of the poppy seeds in the rice bowl there, and that's fine as long as it works. But my worry is that, especially, I don't want to make too much of this, but it's illustrative of a broader point that I want to make, which is that for somebody like me who has certain views about our analytical understanding of the sociology of Sri Lankan constitutionalism, poppy seeds in the rice bowl may well describe the majority-minority relationship among whites and blacks in the United States, but it probably will not about Tamils and Sinhalese. Why? Because, in my view, analytically, and therefore, and everything that flows from it, including how we think about the normative and constitutional design aspects of this conundrum, the Tamil claim is made from an extremely different point of view. It's not a dispersed minority seeking constitutional accommodation as a minority. It is it makes claims to nationhood. And particularly it makes a territorial claim. So they say that they are effectively self-governing, either as an independent entity in international law or as a federal one within the Sri Lankan constitutional framework, reformulated framework. And that's really not. So in that sense, so the point that I'm sort of briefly trying to make here is that throughout there are some issues where where the use of certain metaphors, and I was struck by the fact that Dinesh picked up on the stillbirth thing from an entirely different point of view. But here, this is another use of a metaphor which the concern is that it may not merely distract, but in fact detract and invite even more critical questions about your main thesis, because it seems to suggest an inappropriate understanding of what the problem really is. I found that the paper was mostly supported by authority, but at crucial places, I was looking for things which were not there. I don't want to be hypercritical on all of this, just because I have views on this, and I'd like you to engage with scholars that I rely on. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But when you are engaging certain issues, as a reader, I would like to know that you have considered what some certain leading authorities have said about this and how you deal with that, whether you adopt them, whether you disagree with them, whether you reject them, whatever it is. And this is particularly the issue when you talk about things like Adeel has already talked about the history and historiography thing. So there is you don't there is no engagement in the paper with that extremely rich historiographical literature and the debates in history, which are central to this single story point, right? The fact that a majoritarian single story has then been responded to by a minoritarian single story, and hidden, and what that serves to, and all those are great points that you make about how that essentializes and how that sort of serves to present very simple, linear, monistic stories about us and about them. All that is valid, but then there's a lot going on there about what we have all the critical literature about all of this. That great debate in the 90s between on the in historical anthropology in Sri Lanka, which is where most of the sort of really exciting action has happened. Constitutional lawyers have not generally not done too much history, or not very well at least. But those very rich debates between people like Jonathan Spencer and Nissan Starat, Pradeep Jagannathan, Malathi, all of that on the one hand, relying especially on the sort of post-Orientalist, perspectives, and then the response to that from people like Michael Roberts, to name perhaps the most sophisticated defender, perhaps of the kind of the singular collective identity positions. So it would be. I mean, I'm not asking you to change the nature of your thing, but given that the ahistoricity or the attack or the critical perspective on history that you take, it is important to say something about what you think of that, because those are that's the relevant literature. The other one is nationalism, right? There is one place where you have cited a very brief piece, very well. The quote is great. It makes the really important point. Again, about ethnic nationalism and all of that. The Harvard scholar, but then this is you're talking. It's the tip of the iceberg of a major area in political sociology. And it's very important. That whole thing about the civic ethnic dichotomy, and it begins there, but there's a hugely sophisticated thing, and particularly Indian scholars who have done huge amounts of work, which are very useful and hardly ever engaged in Sri Lankan debates. I'm talking about people like Rajiv Bhargava, and so on. So how Western debates over that artificial analytical distinction between civic and ethnic nationalism, how we engage that in our South Asian cultural and post-colonial context. None of that is engaged with, and I found that I was left feeling okay. I wanted something about this in this paper. Another example is the use of divide and rule. Now again, it looks as if you adopt without any discussion, let alone critique, an ideological assertion about the theory of divide and rule as being the story of British imperialism in South Asia. And this is not I'm not inviting you to an ideological disagreement. You can hold that view, but you have to also be conscious of the fact that there is a large and very nuanced and sophisticated literature, and even ultimately, your fundamental position on this is that communalism was inflamed, if not created, by divide and rule policies or in 19th century British colonial Ceylon. Well, I mean, there are lots of things to be said about this, right? Because it goes to the heart of the main argument of the paper. So just offering without explaining, this is because divide and rule happened, to me is a very unsatisfactory way of engaging with the impact of British colonialism on collective identities in a society like Sri Lanka's. It did have a role, but it is absolutely just not the whole thing at all, and it just can't serve as a kind of um, universal explanatory theory at all for the central constitutional problem that is the focus of your paper. I will come to the constitutional theory and constitutional design issues in a moment. So in that sense, it returns to an old story. It is definitely the most relevant constitutional question we have to deal with in the Sri Lankan situation, and more broadly, not only the present but also generally the story of constitutional development and state building after independence. And it does in some places there is a really sort of sparkling engagement with some insights from Derrida and Fontaine, Haraway, Gramsci. I thought was very, I mean that whole sort of little bit about Gramsci was very interesting. Gramsci is eternally a rewarding writer to engage with. And more could be done. And once again, and in that vein, the Gramscian perspectives that you have used, the insights that you have used, have been once again developed by a generation of South Asian sort of Marxist scholars in phenomenally interesting ways, right? Nazir Hussain, Hamza Alawi, all of these people. Where I would like at least a footnote to show me that you know what this is all about. So again, I mean, this reads like a litany of criticisms. Don't take it like that, right? This is all this is not a fundamental attack. I'm just asking you to, I'm just sort of cataloging the questions that were raised in my mind when I was reading it. And if you deal with them, to me, it will, really improve the paper. And I want this paper to be published. So the main aim of the paper is to offer a kind of explanatory theory of congenital reform failure, right? And the argument is that the path-dependent single stories and othering creates a kind of essentializing effect on the two main communal identities, and with all the inherent and consequential problems with essentialization, that's a very strong aspect of that discussion. I thought you really sort of deal with that fairly well, and that this whole path-dependent single story, the competition of single stories, generates a kind of incommensurable constitutional disagreement that creates a state of constitutional dysfunction. Okay, so far so good. It's then what is left. So let me. I know I'm Dinesh. How long do I have? Where should I finish? In
another 4 minutes.
4 minutes, great. Yeah, that was my estimation as well. So I'll just sort of categorize. There's a lot going on here, and I'm very happy to have further conversations to clarify, because I do realize that I'm now getting into a fairly niche area of constitutional theory, which I don't blame you for not engaging with, but I do think that if you do engage with it, that without changing your fundamental argument, your argument can be deepened and improved. And in this respect, I'll categorize the sort of issues in three ways. I see analytical issues, I see a set of normative issues, and I see a set of prescriptive issues. And the analytical issues I've already said certain things about, and that's about national identities and formation of collective identities, historiographies. Adeel has really well dealt with already. But the story about, at the end of the day, I mean, what you frame through the single story and othering argument is quite nothing very unusual at the end of the day. I mean, this is how nations and national identities, or even non-national collective identities, are built everywhere in the world and throughout history. So you need to be able to tell me through greater engagement with the sociological, and perhaps in our case, the historical anthropology literature, why is it that the single story and the othering stuff already, again, that's some people have done some work on this. There is that SSA collection, which I've forgotten now. Was it Neluca de Silva? where where that kind of theory was fairly well done. But again, I didn't find a reference to that. But the political sociology and the historical anthropology literatures on the formation of national identities, you need to be able to engage with that and say how it is that you are offering something new and why we should be persuaded that what your story is the better one, right? It also again raises a whole set of normative issues like the ones that some that I've already made reference to, and Adil did towards the end when he talked about liberalism and all of that. That there is an assumption here that this kind of ethnic essentialization is is a very bad thing, right? And yeah, okay, it is a bad thing to the extent that it creates exclusion and violence and discrimination and constitutional dysfunction and all of that kind of stuff. Yes, it is true. But more theoretically, what is it about it that, and why is it that we should be critical of it, and how can we be critical of it, right? And is it by simply positing then liberalism or some variant of the of liberalism as a superior and better way of dealing with this? And if so, why should we accept it? How is it that we can tell somebody in the Sinhala Buddhist hinterland, um, this point about what you're doing is a very bad thing? They're not going to accept that, right? Because that is fundamentally their identity, and so we need to be able to tell them in a way that they can engage with, if not agree with, right? What it is, and in that sense, that's why we need to engage the Asian and global South engagement with liberalism, right, at the normative level, in some way in this paper, in order to be able to offer an alternative normativity to that of the single story, right? And the single story is democratically validated and very, very resilient. So so as scholars, if we are using the techniques of persuasion in order to offer ways out of this, then we need to be able to do that without assuming that just because we think something is good, and you'll recall at this point the point that I made to the two of you, Dinesh and you, when I had a different view about socioeconomic rights in the law faculty, about why is it that I should accept two Harvard educated lawyers who are going to sit in a constitutional court and decide distributive questions where if I don't agree with it, right? Is it because you are better educated than me? You know, and the same kind of question arises in this. Then finally, it's a prescriptive thing, and this is me talking now, moving from sort of the normative, the slightly more theoretical concerns to the more practical and the design matters. What is the overall framework within which, if your main thesis is accepted, that we can manage, if not transcend this the central constitutional challenge, right? That you say very little about that stuff, and it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, if this assumption is wrong, but since you have not made this explicit in the paper, and there's no framework offered in the paper, I have to interpret something, and the assumption that I'm going on is that and it seems to me that the sort of assumed basis on which you're making the critique and you're hoping that it can be transcended is a sort of a kind of very orthodox, what's known as the post-war paradigm. Lorraine Weinrib piece in Sujit Chowdhury's book is basically the sort of post-war paradigm of nation-state building and about constitutions, or written constitution, which is supreme, constitutional review, democracy, all of this, the sort of the basic heuristic framework around which everything has, all social sciences have been built, but is becoming really problematic because it is not working. If that whole teleological, in fact, it is a single story in itself. It's more inclusive and civic, but the nation state model is, and a constitution based on the so the argument is that if you shed your primordial, backward, ethnic, religious identities and essentially single stories, and come and join me in the exciting project of modernity, of building the civic nation state. I will give you equality. I will give you non-discrimination. I will give you everything short of heaven on earth. Okay, but that in itself is not only teleological but also homogenizing and highly monistic in a situation in which people don't look at it. I mean, what is the empirical reality of South Asian societies? It is pluralism. So how do we deal with the central meta-constitutional issue of deeply felt and held, pluralism of identities, and how valid ethically is it also to make fundamental attacks on that conception of the good from what is, quite frankly, an extraneous cultural perspective.
Asanga, I might have to interrupt
That's
you.
it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I invite Danushka to respond, I just want to say that I will begin to maintain a queue. In fact, I already have Tarun on it, so please feel free to raise your virtual hand or send me a message via the chat, or even to place your question or comment on the chat itself, and I will keep a running list of the questions and comments. Danushka, you may respond, you may take about 5 minutes and respond to any of the reactions that we've heard so far. Entirely up to you to use this time the way you would like to.
So first of all, I should say that I did not think about the other ramifications that will come with the use of the metaphor stillbirth. That did not occur to me. I only thought about it in the sense that I'm talking about constitutional processes that begin and then come to a halt, and then another party gets into power and they begin another one and it comes to a halt. So that was the only way in which I thought about it. And this was enlightening because I did not even think there was the other possibility of us going into stereotypes about things that I don't even talk about in the paper, which is a reality, and I understand that and I agree with it. And Dr. Adeel's comments on whether I'm kicking out history, I did not realize that I'm doing it. That was not intentional. And when you explained it to me, I understood that I am actually doing it. So I need to respond to that. And thank you very much for giving me recommendations to read up on and flesh that out. And Dr. Welikala, what you said about congenital reform failure is how I'm looking at it. Again, that's not something that even entered my head as I was writing it. And I understand that I have just accepted that divide and rule is something that happened and worked on that premise. Again, I realize that's an assumption that I made without engaging in it. So I think there are so many things that I can use in terms of improving this. Um, I I have a question though for Dr. Welikala. This is about like how I'm going to respond to this. When you said that I have gone on and talked about the fundamental problem that we have in Sri Lanka, and I don't necessarily produce an alternative, and I'm not necessarily telling them to go into buying into the civic nationalism. That's not something I agree with. I thought I agreed with it at some point, but I'm sort of like a solution. I only had the criticism of the positions, so I don't know how to deal with it. So how what do you suggest that I do in a situation like this where I don't know how to produce a solution and I only have a critique of an existing situation? How do I deal with that as someone who is young trying to write something?
Thank you, Danushka. So I will first invite Tarun to respond and then let Asanga respond to your specific questions, Danushka. Tarun?
Thanks very much, Tanisha, for giving me the floor. And Anushka, really interesting paper. And in the constructive but robust vein of JFF discussions, I'm going to highlight a few things. And it's good to have you hear both from Asanga and from me because I'm going to disagree with a lot of things he's told you. So that you can then see that there is great intellectual diversity in the field and make up your own mind. right? So the first on style, and the main comment I have on style is to not write for Asanga, right? And why am I saying that, right? So I think when I'm thinking about how I write, I think about who the ideal reader is, right? And the problem with thinking of Asanga as your ideal reader is that he knows too much and he's too well read, and he already knows and is steeped in the literature that you are reading and engaging with and writing about, right? And the trouble in that readership as the speaking to is that there are very few Asangas in the world, and that is just an unfortunate aspect of the world. But it's just the world as you have to take as it is, right? So I would I would assume your reader to be intelligent, right? But not someone who is steeped in the intellectual traditions and discourses that you're engaging with. Not somebody, you have to write for somebody who may well know what path dependency means, who may have heard of Derrida, but does not. Okay, you can make your choices, right? This is a strategic advice. This is not, of course, this will get published in a journal, right? But the question is how, if you're thinking about how many people I want to reach out to, and I think this is a burden that people in the global south with English, with as not, I think this will be someone with English as their first language would struggle with a lot of jargon that you assume to be accessible. But certainly people with English as a second language would struggle with it in the region, right? So you need to make your choices about who is that intelligent reader you want to reach out to, but not necessarily somebody who has this jargon as an easy part of their vocabulary. And if you don't want to speak to them, that's fine, right? So if you're speaking to an audience that's largely based in the global north, mostly elite universities, speaks a language of critical studies, knows their continental philosophy, then this paper is fine. If you want an audience that is based in South Asia, probably only studied constitutional law in law school, that's what they're interested in, that's their entry point to your paper, you will lose them by the second page. And so it's a strategic choice you need to make. And I think that you should be at least trying to speak to that second audience as well, right? And if you have to make the choice, I would rather speak to the second audience, which is not to say don't use these people, do, but move them to the footnote. Explain, even the fable that you use of the wolf and the sheep, you assume that people know what the fable is. No, explain to them what the fable is. Don't quote so much. Speak in plain English. Translate a lot of these people in your own words, and maybe you move the quotations to the footnote. So I think that is a burden that our generation has to bear. And at least I know that I'm belaboring the point, but with the crisis of constitutionalism in India, a lot of us are struggling with the idea of accessibility, and there's a huge hunger for accessing the normative vocabulary of the Constitution. The protests that India has seen in Delhi since the Citizenship Amendment Act, etc. So my entry point is there, right? A lot of us are speaking now in Hindi, in other Indian languages. So there's a huge hunger for this normative language, and a lot of people feel excluded by an inability to engage with it. So I'm just, and in fact, I will shut up on style after saying this, right? Gayatri Spivak's paper, Can the Subaltern Speak? Certainly not like her, right? Isn't that the irony of the paper is that it's written in this completely unintelligible language, right? Which the subaltern will not speak or understand, right? So all I'm saying is that if I were you, I would be worried about beginning to talk in a way that sounds cool in certain verified academic circles in the United States, but have very little cachet in people outside those networks. The one, so that's just some sort of pushback on style. I think you should listen to Asanga's comment towards the end very seriously about what's new in this thesis. What are you telling us that we don't already know? Because why is this not straightforward discourse on nationalism with Sri Lankan examples? Nationalism requires a self and the other who demonize each other, stereotype each other, create group rather than individual, make guilt and virtue as attributes of groups rather than of individuals. So I was just struggling to think about, well, A, what's new in it, and why you, at one place in the paper, you frame it as a problem of democracy. I'm like, this is not a problem of democracy. This is a problem of nationalism, right? Or in, our imaginations are of course limited by not knowing what a non-national democratic world might look like, right? But the root of the problem seems to me not one of democracy, if it's possible to imagine a world which is democratic and not national. But if the root of the problem is nationalism, but then what are you adding to it? What is this paper telling me that I don't already know? As an idea, I can see the value of showing how this is playing out in Sri Lanka as well. But Benedict Anderson has told us this about nationalism, and it's a useful footnote to that. But is there more to it? So the second point I want to make. The third point is, if this is a paper about the problems that nationalism poses to constitutionalism and constitutional design, then there's a whole range of literature that you haven't engaged with here. Right? And Asanga mentioned, Sajid Chaudhry's work, but so constitutionalism, at least a huge chunk of constitutionalism is an attempt to figure out how can we live without killing each other, given nationalism as a reality. Right? If that is the problem, then the paper only reposes the problem of how do we design a constitution we can all accept, given the reality of nationalism. But that question has been posed by many people many times, including, I suspect, in the Sri Lankan context. So you need to tell me as a reader what it is that you're adding to the story. By the way, this relates to style, because I think I would state very clearly at the start, this is your claim, and this is what's innovative about it. This is, so not just stating your claim clearly at the outset, but also the so what question. Why should a reader care about this claim, right? And they should care for intellectual reasons, that you're going to teach them something they don't already know, and then set out the argumentative map. I think it's completely okay to not have a solution. I'm interested to see what Asanga advises you on that. I think, you're an academic, not an activist. You don't have to have all the answers for the world, and telling the world this is a problem is absolutely valid. You don't have to have a solution as it were. And sometimes I think the problem with a lot of sort of academic work that comes from practicing law is that it moves too quickly to normative solutions without lingering on understanding the problem. So I wouldn't be worried about that. I also want to resist perhaps Adeel's and Asanga's accusation of your work as presuming the validity of liberalism. The idea that killing, dominating, discriminating against people is a bad thing is not a liberal idea. It long predates liberalism. It's a basic moral principle, goes back to the moral equality of human beings. It's present in almost every religion, certainly in Christianity, in Islam, in Buddhism. So I would not be defensive about that. I don't think that, this idea that people should not dominate each other, should not kill each other, should live in peace, is such a fundamental moral truth. And such a familiar moral truth to all sorts of intellectual, philosophical worldviews that I would not feel the need to say, to spend time defending it. In the question that Asanga poses to you, the burden of persuasion of somebody who rejects basically the moral equality of persons, I don't think you need to carry that burden of persuasion in this paper, because your burden of persuasion is the burden to persuade for your argument. I think you're entitled as an academic to accept that, because that's not a particularly controversial, morally controversial issue. I think the burden of proof as an academic depends on the burden of it depends on, is proportional to how controversial a claim you're making. It is an entirely legitimate academic project, one that takes seriously the idea, how does the state or I or a politician convince people who reject the moral equality of persons, the Sinhalese person who rejects the moral equality of Tamils. But that's not your project. And I think that's a project not about moral truths, but about the the old Marxist idea of propaganda, not bereft of its negative connotation, right? Of perpetuating, propagandizing moral truths, right? And it's also a legitimate moral academic project to revisit the moral truth of moral claim about moral equality of persons. But again, that's not your project. So I would not be defensive about those things. And I think to the extent that liberalism endorses moral equality of persons, so does almost every serious philosophical worldview, including Marxism, including socialism. Fascism, of course, rejects it, but I don't think you need to pick that battle up. So anyway, those are some of the thoughts I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarun. Before I pass the virtual mic back to Danushka, I was wondering whether Adeel, you have any comments to add?
I don't have any comments to add.
Thanks, Adeel. Danushka?
I don't have to defend. So I'm convinced with these arguments. I just need to write another paper to defend it, because this has gone into publish. So I can imagine ways of doing it. I'm trying to think about it.
All right. Thank you. Then I think, can I call on Asanga to respond to some of the questions and issues that Tarun placed on the table, Asanga, on, substantive as well as style? Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly. It's on both style and the last point about norms. It's both agreement and disagreement. The way that I approach this is dependent on the audience that I'm writing for, and my assumption here was that this is an academic a submission to an academic journal to be read by specialists of some sort in the broad social sciences, who will have some familiarity with all of the kinds of issues that you're dealing with and the literatures that you are engaging. And in that sense, you can use a bit of shorthand in order that you make space in order to make your own points. Instead of, necessarily, I'm not saying that Tarun was saying that you should be, this is entirely a question of trying to educate an audience, but to write simply and plainly. In my case, of course, as you know very well, I write to for general audience a lot. So that is the place where I would, and once again, even within that, in the Sri Lankan context, it just depends. If you're writing to a mainstream newspaper, you need to have that audience in mind. If you are writing to for a blog which is read by a particular kind of audience, you can assume certain things and then write accordingly and so on. So that's the way I navigate that problem. But the point is, of course, well made, that in across all of these, writing for all of these audiences, that you should be clear about what you're saying. And judged from that light, I just felt that you weren't especially, obscurantist in in this at all. But there you go. I mean, um, uh, those are perfectly legitimate disagreements to have. The last point, agree and disagree. And here's the point. I mean, on the thing, it's not only liberalism. It's not only political liberalism of the Western tradition that has things to say about the moral worthiness of equality and nonviolence and all of that kind of stuff. But if you take what uh, you know people generally associated with moderation and inclusion in Sri Lanka, they would always reach as their sort of normative armory. Always start you would start with Western political philosophy, and the reason, and in Sri Lanka, I feel that that is one of the reasons. That's certainly not all of it, and you don't have to be defensive about it. That's the way. If that's the way you want to do it, that's fine. I mean, and you don't have to join the nationalists in their insularity, but you need to be clear about what you're doing. But and my argument also is that certainly in the Sri Lankan context, arguments for inclusion in a plural polity have not engaged as much as we ought to have with the cultural, intellectual, and normative resources we have in our own traditions. And that is not to draw a sharp line between West and us. It is to make that point that we too often by assuming that the only way that we can make these arguments is by instant recourse to Western political philosophy, we also expose ourselves to the claim that this is not us, this is not authentic, and hence we limit our persuasive reach as a result. So that's the point that I think trying to make. But the specific thing I think where I probably was not very clear and which led Tarun to disagree with me was this, and that is that in my interpretation of your paper, the unstated premise, the unstated constitutional framework that you have in mind in critiquing the single story or the competition of single story narratives is a kind of nation state model. To me, the nation state model, even assuming that we are fully agreed that a plural society requires inclusion through some mixture of shared and self-rule for territorially concentrated minorities. The nation-state model is very homogenizing and very monistic. It is almost, certainly at a theoretical level, can be argued is inappropriate as a heuristic model for thinking about categories like constitution, sovereignty, democracy, all of these things. And we just don't have the luxury in Sri Lanka of having a relatively well-established, obviously the Nehruvian settlement is under fundamental attack in India right now, but this is a very recent thing for you. India is an outlier in the post-colonial world in having had a long period of post-colonial stability around which the nation state could take root around your much venerated constitution. The Sri Lankan story is entirely different. It is an out ethnocracy where the majority seized control of the state and then through periodic democratic validation continue to recreate the state entirely in the image of its own collective self-identity, which is then what excludes and leads to conflict. So in that scenario, to think that we can deracinate, if to the extent that our constitutional approach is simply to take away the Sinhala Buddhist character of the Sri Lankan state and make it a more civic and democratic one, and that settles the matter, I think that bus has now gone. Certainly at the level of theory. I don't know in practice. We'll have to think about it. And my way of doing that is to, and that's a different conversation. I don't want to get into that. That's a very, very long one. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Asanga. I have Guru first. followed by Ayesha. Sorry, Adeel, do you have a comment?
Just very, very briefly,
Yeah.
I wanted to say when Tarun was raising the point that the underlying assumption doesn't need to be defended. So maybe, so the first conceptual step is the annihilation of history that happens in that paper. So therefore, the amount of things that we can now pick from are limited to legal positivism and the specific relationship it has to constitutionalism. So the way in which it happens in Europe is that many people are standing up against, the early written constitution by saying that they're all designed by Jewish scholars because Jews have a reason to delete the history of suffering and to present themselves as good citizens and good individuals. So they want to delete history. So the moment we bring in history and we bring in, the other different tradition, then we're in a different conceptual framework than the one that Danushka is constructing. So either the paper has to change that or it has to run with the assumption. It doesn't mean that I believe that, otherwise people will sort of kill themselves. That's not the thing. It's just that the paper works in this specific way. Thank you.
Thanks, Adeel. So call on Guru first, followed by Ayesha, and then we also have Tarun if there's time. We have 12 minutes in total, so I think we can take all these questions or comments. Over to you, Guru.
Quickly, Danushka, thank you very much. Quickly, 2 points. First is on the question of whether we need to problematize your portrayal of the two nationalisms and the constitutional advocacies that have made as being single path. I don't necessarily think that they are single path. I think there's more sort of plurality there. And particularly there's quite a lot of rich sort of discourse to engage with, particularly around Tamil political parties engaging with the constitutional process that failed between 2015 and 19. The whole sort of TNA's willingness to engage with the notion of Orumitha Nadu, United Sri Lanka, without ascribing to a particular sort of character of state as either unitary or federal, them willing to even consider Article 9 remaining as part of the Constitution in exchange for retaining some form of revolution or better version of formulation. So I think there is, the question is then why there hasn't been a critical mass around that kind of articulation and why discourse and why it hasn't succeeded. And I think there is a need for engagement with. I think this portrayal of single path is problematic. I think there is more plurality to both the discourses that needs to be engaged with. B, but I also want to push you on what exactly. I think Asanga mentioned this as well. What exactly we tried? You're trying to. You're trying to produce by questioning the essentialization. I absolutely take the point about the problems with essentialization, but when constitution engages with diversity, right, at some point it needs to essentialize identities and provide for institution forms of support that treat these identities as essential, whether it be, for example, reservations in India, whether it be, for example, identifying a particular territory with a linguistic group. There is some level of essentialization that constitutions will have to do. Isn't the real question that we need to be aware of those essentializations that constitutions unavoidably have to make, and hence re-question, revisit the kind of essentializations that we've drawn with constitutions and willing to include the excluded through those essentializations that we have to that constitutions anyway produce, that it's being the exclusivity that law actually produces, law or constitutions definitely will produce, and revisiting those in line of the larger moral worthiness of equality projects, right? So the point that I'm making is that I think particularly when constitutions engage diversity, some level of essentialization is unavoidable. And what I think scholars need to point out, particularly constitutional scholars, is that we need to remind ourselves of the exclusions that we produce by the generalizations and try to better the constitution towards. So it's a pathway that we have to travel down unavoidably and keep asking those questions rather than wishing away essentializations, if I may.
Thank you, Guru. Ayesha? I think you need to unmute yourself, Ayesha.
Hello. Yeah, sorry. It happens always. So first of all, I must really thank you for this wonderful discussion. It helped me reflect on my own research because I think that my research is not historical enough, actually. And probably with the conversation that I've had with Dinesh, I realized that I'm trying to incorporate history into my own work where I feel that mine is still theoretical, perhaps. So to Danushka, what I have to say is that, first of all, I must confess that I only managed to have a cursory glance over your paper. And so I haven't really read in detail. But so more than a comment, what I actually have for you is a suggestion and perhaps some insight to the literature that I've read and whether that would be helpful for your paper in improving your research further. So, so in your attempt to critique constitutional failure, and especially because you also mentioned about path dependency, I was wondering whether you'd like to engage methodologically and also perhaps theoretically on historical institutionalism, and whether literature by Paul Pearson on politics in time can be helpful. Perhaps it might not be relevant to your work on single stories narrative, but I was just wondering whether you could use the single stories narrative and see its impact on institutions in showing this constitutional failure. But perhaps this is not the aim of your paper, but perhaps and what you want to do is perhaps entirely different, but I have a feeling that perhaps this literature would be helpful. And I know that Neil DeWater has worked on it. He has used historical institutionalism to explain the ethnic conflict, and I'm just wondering whether you could engage further on theoretically explaining constitutional failure in Sri Lanka. Just some recommendation on further reading, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you, Ayesha. Danushka, before I come back to you, Tarun would like to respond to Asanga. So I think we have two parallel conversations going here, which is great. Disagreement always sort of leads us to think more sharply, I feel. So Tarun, over to you.
Well, so Dinesh, I'm going to disappoint you because I'm going to partially agree with Asanga on scholarly agendas and how to pick them, or at least this is, and I'm very glad that Rohan's hand has gone up because I was just egging him on through chat to make the point, and he'll make this point much better than I'm going to. But so first I want to distinguish between sort of distinguishing the academic inquiries about whether an idea is true from whether it's useful, right? And inability to distinguish that also confuses the academic role and the activist role. But as long as we are clear-eyed about that, and Rohan and I have been having this conversation about how there is an untapped, vast, and this is I think what Asanga was hinting at, resource, intellectual resource that we haven't drawn upon to emphasize the moral equality of persons or other values that we hold dear, or that a lot of us would like to be to have greater uptake in the region. So I know that Ron is thinking about Buddhism and its own internal resources. I'm thinking about a project at some stage on sort of proto-constitutional thought in in religious traditions, in pre-colonial traditions, and things like that. So I think, and that is thinking about utility, right? Because I'm not. And so this is the second point I want to make about whether, we can acknowledge the limitations of the liberal endorsement of moral equality without also needing to say that that is wrong, because that's, a lot of the critics of liberalism obviously also agree with liberalism on its essential claim, right? But I want to also problematize its historicity, and in some ways, in the same vein as Guru's question, a lot of people in India are also rejecting the Western Oriental framing of liberalism as a Western idea, right? So so we are in some ways buying into the imperial discourse in giving up on authorship and ownership of the liberal project based on its origin stories, right? I don't know anything enough about Sri Lanka to say anything seriously, but India has had at least 200 years of serious political engagement with civil liberties and liberalism in a deep way, and also framing the international liberal order post Second World War, right? So accepting that this is their idea in some ways is also this civilizational colonial trope, right? That we are the civilizing people who will teach you how to do things, right? Isn't a huge part of the, Dadabhai Naroji, he wrote that book, Un-British Rule in India. A huge part of the colonial struggle was to show British hypocrisy of not being true to their professed worldviews, right? So I think a two-pronged strategy of finding the autochthonous or domestic roots of liberalism, but also using other local or domestic, in quotes, worldviews to support moral ideas like equal, moral worth of all persons. I think they should both form part of sort of what a truly South Asian constitutional discourse might look like. I'll shut up, and I'm very glad to see that Rohan is speaking.
Thanks, Tarun. If everyone's okay with it, we can take 5 more minutes. Rohan, over to you.
Thanks. No, I just want to sort of agree with Tarun's point, and Asanga mentioned it in his presentation, this thing about trying to find local, sort of defend some of the values of liberalism and even constitutionalism from within our local traditions. And I know Binendri, who's with us, she presented a paper recently where she tried. I just want to agree with Tarun that perhaps we need to do more of that. And I'm happy that some of scholars attached to the law faculty are planning to do that. But the point that I just like to flag in the 1 minute left is when I first read Anushka's paper, I was actually suggesting to her that to use the approach that she has adopted, kind of teaching methodology, say at the law faculty in the University of Colombo, will be very useful. Many Guru, Binendri, Anita, Dinesh, all of you, we had this course called Constitutional Law 2, the primary purpose of which was to make law students a little bit more aware of the complexity of, dealing with Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict, to get them to unlearn some of the things that they had learned in school. And I actually thought that Danushka's paper could be a kind of guide to redesign the course so that it becomes a little bit more exciting and interesting for students. And I would just like to ask Asanga and Guru and people whether they thought that there would be any point or any utility in trying to do that. And Danushka and I were talking about having a workshop at the University of Colombo, bringing in people from the history departments and try to make that course much more, interdisciplinary, because I think longer term, we need to just build up, a body of opinion which looks at things with a little bit more nuance and sophistication. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan. So Binendri's paper, in fact, I think looks at principles that can be derived from Buddhism and how they sit alongside of principles of constitutionalism. So before I give the final say to Danushka, Asanga, would you like to make a quick response?
If you want me to, yes. Obviously the last 2 points are very much I'm in agreement with. Tarun, the thing to remember when we're dealing with Sri Lanka is that what you take, what you can, the many of the things that that are true in the Indian experience are simply not true in our case. That engagement with colonial, that intellectual engagement with ideas that is so much a part of the anti-colonial movement in India is just absent, and neither have we derivatively learned from it, except for a very few scholars having a very rarefied conversation about some of this stuff. And to the extent in Sri Lanka that we have, like Rohan was suggesting, and Rohan and I have been talking about this for years, about looking at the pre-colonial past. When you think about constitutional categories, we take this Daisian stuff that have been appropriated by Sinhala Buddhist nationalism as as something that there's so much you can if your idea, if your intention like mine is to knock them down, it's the easiest thing to do. But those conversations are not happening because there's just not enough people working on these things. And to the extent that that work has happened, and it has, in fact, in a very exciting way, it's in historical anthropology, and about 20 people understand that literature. And going back to that other point you were making, and in that sense, I fully agree. I mean, the only reason why I know something about it is because it was central to my PhD thesis, and I was doing nothing else but reading that stuff and having to actually immerse myself in a discipline that I was unfamiliar with in order to. But if I was not engaging with that in any other context other than a full-time PhD, I would not understand it, right? And this is the point that Rohan is making, that we should find ways of. I mean, I know people like Roshan De Silva and others who have a leg in both disciplines, in law as well as this historical anthropology, but we have to get Roshan to talk in an intelligible way. And so in that sense, doing something around the faculty so that we can bring regional and other scholars together to have this conversation about law teaching and to teach constitutional law, integrate all this stuff into I think we need to really seriously think about that. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Adeel, you switched your video on. Is that an indication you would like to make a comment? No. Okay. All right. So thank you, everyone. And I apologize for extending the discussion, but I felt like it was getting to that point where we had to extend it at least by 5 minutes. First of all, I would like to thank Adeel and Asanga. Thank you very much for taking the time to engage with Danushka's work and to give her this useful feedback, but also for generating this conversation around some of these issues that Danushka's paper is. Thank you very much for your time. Danushka, thank you very much for giving us your paper and for allowing us to have this conversation. As you can see, it has been very useful for us as attendees as well. Animesh, Prakash, and Swati, thank you very much for doing all the logistical, making sure that all the logistical arrangements were in place. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And all the attendees, thank you very much for your time and for your engagement. We do appreciate it. The next announcement will be emailed and it will be tweeted, so watch out for it and look forward to seeing you again in February. Thank you very much.